In the heart of Europe, nestled within the rugged embrace of the Cottian Alps where France and Italy meet, lived a people apart. For centuries, these valleys were home to the Waldensians, also known as the Vaudois, a religious community whose roots stretched deep into the medieval past. Their long history was intertwined with the very mountains that sheltered them, a testament to endurance in the face of recurring storms. But in the mid-17th century, under the rule of Duke Charles Emmanuel II of Savoy, the simmering cauldron of religious intolerance, fueled by the fervent fires of the Counter-Reformation, was about to boil over. A tragedy was brewing, an event that would scar the landscape and echo through history as the Piedmontese Easter, a brutal episode of violence that threatened this ancient community with annihilation. How did it come to this? How could a people who saw themselves as guardians of an ancient faith face such utter devastation? Their story is one of profound faith, relentless persecution, and the shocking collision of local lives with the grand, often merciless forces of European politics and religion. The Waldensian story traditionally begins not in the Alps, but in the bustling city of Lyon, France, around the year 1170. There, a wealthy merchant named Valdez, or Peter Waldo, experienced a profound spiritual crisis. Moved by the scriptural call to perfection, he renounced his wealth, gave his possessions to the poor, and dedicated his life to preaching the gospel. His followers became known as the Poor of Lyon, or the poor in spirit, emphasizing a life of voluntary poverty and strict adherence to the Bible. Central to their practice was the belief that the Bible, the Word of God, should be accessible to all, leading Waldo to commission translations into the common tongue. They became known as the people of the book. Their core beliefs, even before the Protestant Reformation reshaped Europe, set them apart from the established church. They stressed lay preaching, controversially even allowing women to preach, a direct challenge to clerical authority. They rejected doctrines and practices they saw as unscriptural or corrupt, the concept of purgatory, prayers for the dead, the veneration of saints, the swearing of oaths, and the accumulation of wealth and political power by the clergy. While initially seeing themselves as reformers within the church and defending certain sacraments like the Eucharist, their insistence on preaching according to their own understanding, often in the vernacular, and their critique of clerical worldliness inevitably led to conflict. Disobeying bans imposed by local church authorities, Waldo and his followers were excommunicated by Pope Lucius III in 1184, not primarily for heresy, but for defiance. Condemnation followed at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Yet, despite persecution and being branded as heretics, the movement spread. Itinerant preachers, known as barba, meaning uncle, a term of respect, traveled in secret, ministering to small groups, hearing confessions, and keeping the faith alive. They found fertile ground in various parts of Europe, but established their most enduring communities in the relative seclusion of the Piedmont valleys, nestled in the Cottian Alps. Here, for generations, they lived primarily as farmers and shepherds, shaping a distinct culture in their mountain refuge. Their claim to ancient, even apostolic origins, while debated by historians, became a cornerstone of their identity, positioning them not as innovators but as preservers of Christianity's original purity. This very claim, however, implicitly challenged the authority of the Roman Church and ensured continued suspicion and hostility. A pivotal moment arrived in 1532 at the Synod of Chanfaran. Hearing of the Reformation sweeping across Europe, the Waldensians sent envoys to confer with reformers like William Farel, Martin Bucer, and Ecolampadius. At Chanfaran, they made the historic decision to formally align themselves with the Protestant cause, specifically embracing the Calvinist tradition. This was more than a theological shift, it was a public declaration. They abandoned any remaining Catholic practices, built their own temples, and held services openly. As a tangible sign of their commitment, they commissioned and financed a new French translation of the Bible by Olivetan, a cousin of John Calvin, presenting it as their gift to the Reformation. This alignment brought them into the fold of international Protestantism, offering potential allies and a clearer theological framework. However, it also irrevocably marked them as Protestants within the domain of a Catholic ruler, erasing any ambiguity about their separation from Rome. They were no longer simply dissenters. They were now part of a rival confession in an age defined by religious conflict. Their existence in the Piedmont valleys was governed by a complex relationship with the ruling dukes of Savoy. A significant, if precarious, measure of security came with the Peace of Cavour in 1561, following armed resistance where the Waldensians, despite their nonviolent traditions, took up arms to defend themselves. The Duke granted them limited tolerance. This treaty was remarkable for its time, acknowledging the right of subjects to hold a different faith from their ruler, albeit confined to specific designated mountain valleys. For nearly a century, this agreement provided a fragile legal basis for their presence, though it was frequently challenged and violated. Life remained centered in their Alpine communities, cultivating the land and tending flocks, largely isolated but maintaining their distinct faith. Yet the very treaty designed to contain them held the seeds of future conflict. As their population grew, some inevitably settled beyond the strict geographical limits defined in 1561. This expansion, driven by necessity, would later provide the pretext for those seeking their destruction. The limited tolerance granted by Cavour could be and would be weaponized against them. The mid-17th century saw Charles Emmanuel II nominally ruling the Duchy of Savoy. Ascending to the ducal throne as a child in 1638, real power initially rested with his mother, Christine of France, who served as regent. Even after Charles Emmanuel reached adulthood in 1648, his mother's influence remained strong, partly because the young duke seemed more interested in a life of pleasure than the burdens of statecraft. This period coincided with the height of the Counter-Reformation, a Europe-wide Catholic resurgence aimed at rolling back Protestant gains and enforcing religious uniformity within Catholic territories. Savoy, bordering France and influenced by its powerful Catholic neighbor, became a stage for these intense religious pressures. A key engine driving the persecution of the Waldensians was the establishment in Turin in 1650 of the new Council of Propagation of the Faith and the Extermination of Heresy. This wasn't just a religious body, it was deeply intertwined with the state, including high-ranking councillors, nobles, and church dignitaries. Its explicit purpose was the conversion or eradication of the Waldensian heresy. This council marked a significant shift from sporadic harassment to a systematic, institutionalized campaign. It employed a range of methods, establishing Catholic missions, often manned by Capuchin friars within Waldensian communities, exerting economic pressure through confiscations and predatory lending schemes disguised as charity, the Monts de Piet, offering financial incentives like dowries for conversion, and using social pressure with organized groups of Catholic women led by the Marchioness de Pianezza, whose husband would soon lead the military campaign, visiting homes to persuade or intimidate. They even solicited funds from Waldensians themselves under duress. This bureaucratization of persecution created a relentless, organized force pushing for a final solution. Under the influence of the Regent Christine and this zealous council, policies towards the Waldensians grew increasingly hostile from the 1640s onwards. An edict in May 1650 formally revoked previous privileges granted to the Waldensians, undermining their legal standing. Other measures, like endorsing the kidnapping of Waldensian children to be raised Catholic, demonstrated the state's willingness to employ brutal tactics. These actions deliberately violated rights and protections the Waldensians believed had been secured through long usage and past agreements. The political vacuum created by the young duke's initial disinterest allowed this hardline agenda to take root, establishing momentum and structures that Charles Emmanuel II would later embrace and intensify when he assumed full power. The stage was being meticulously set for confrontation. The breaking point came in the harsh winter of 1655. On January 25th, an order was issued by Andrea Gastaldo, a doctor of civil laws and a prominent member of the Council for the Propagation of the Faith, acting under the Duke's authority. This Edict of Gastaldo delivered a brutal ultimatum to the Waldensian communities residing in the lower, more fertile parts of the valleys, specifically naming towns like Lucerna, San Giovanni, La Torre, and Bubbiana. Within a mere 3 days, every Waldensian family, regardless of rank or condition, was commanded to abandon their homes, lands, and possessions in these areas. They were to relocate to the restricted, impoverished upper valleys, places like Bobbio, Angrogna, and Rora. The only alternatives offered were stark: convert to Catholicism within 20 days, or sell their property, only to Catholics, within the same time frame. Failure to comply meant death and the confiscation of all they owned. The cruelty of the edict was compounded by its timing. Issued in the dead of winter, it demanded the impossible, uprooting entire communities, including the elderly, sick, and young children, and forcing them on a perilous journey through snow-covered mountains within 3 days was logistically unfeasible and deliberately inhumane. It was an engineered crisis, seemingly designed to provoke non-compliance and thus provide a justification for military force. Furthermore, the order targeted the most economically viable Waldensian lands, aiming to cripple the community by forcing them into less productive areas while facilitating the transfer of their property to Catholics. The edict also mandated that Catholic Mass be celebrated in the designated refuge zones and forbade any hindrance to Catholic missionary work, adding religious insult to material injury. Faced with this impossible demand, the Waldensians largely refused to obey. They argued the injustice of the order, the violation of past agreements like the Peace of Cavour, and the sheer impossibility of compliance in the harsh winter conditions. Attempts to negotiate through ambassadors were summarily rejected. While most stayed put, defying the order, some 2,000 souls did attempt the harrowing journey, marking their trail with blood in the snow, seeking refuge with their brethren in the upper valleys. Their defiance, however predictable and justified, sealed their fate. The Duke's government now had its pretext. The Waldensian refusal to abandon their homes triggered the military response foreshadowed by the Edict of Gastaldo. The Savoyard government dispatched a large military force into the valleys, with estimates suggesting over 15,000 soldiers were eventually stationed among the Waldensian communities. Their mission, even before the full-scale massacre, included plundering and burning homes. Leading this expedition was Charles Emmanuel Philibert, the Marquis of Pianezza. Pianezza was not merely a military commander. He was known as a zealous Catholic, and his wife was the influential head of the women's branch of the Council for the Propagation of the Faith, the very body orchestrating the anti-Waldensian campaign. The composition of Pianezza's army revealed the broader dimensions of the conflict. It included not only local Savoyard troops, but also significant contingents of French and Irish soldiers. Some accounts suggest around 5,000 French regulars, possibly borrowed from a nearby army marching to fight the Spanish in Lombardy, formed a core part of the assault force. The presence of Irish Catholic troops is particularly noteworthy. Some may have been motivated by animosity towards Protestants, potentially linked to Oliver Cromwell's recent campaigns in Ireland, thus adding another layer of international religious conflict to the situation. The use of these foreign troops, less likely to have local sympathies, hinted at a strategy intended to ensure ruthless execution of orders. Initially, Pianezza established a presence in the Police Valley, particularly around Torre Pellice, with a smaller contingent, perhaps 700 men. The Waldensians, alerted by warnings from their Swiss co-religionists, were not caught entirely by surprise and had initially withdrawn to defensive positions in the hills, observing the troops below. However, reports suggest a crucial element of deception was employed. Under the guise of needing quarters, or perhaps offering false assurances of peace, troops were billeted in Waldensian homes. This tactic allowed the soldiers to infiltrate the communities, neutralizing potential defenses and positioning themselves for the coordinated attack that was to follow. It was a strategy designed not for conventional battle, but for massacre. The storm broke during Easter week, 1655, on Saturday, April 24th, according to several accounts. At the chillingly early hour of 4 a.m., the signal was given for a general assault. The timing, coinciding with the holiest week of the Christian calendar, lent a particularly bitter irony to the unfolding horror, forever branding the event as the Piedmontese Easter. The violence was unleashed primarily in the Pellice Valley and the surrounding areas, whose inhabitants had defied the Edict of Gastaldo. What followed was not warfare, but butchery, marked by unimaginable cruelty. Accounts compiled by survivors like the pastor Jean Leger and later documented by investigators like Samuel Morland paint a horrific picture. Soldiers, given license to pillage and kill, rampaged through the valleys. Men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. The violence was characterized by extreme sadism and torture. Victims were burned alive, flayed, impaled, mutilated while still living, their limbs hacked or torn off. Some were decapitated, their heads used in cruel mockery. Others were reportedly plowed into their own fields. Soldiers rubbed salt and gunpowder into wounds. Rape was widespread. Families were deliberately targeted in acts of performative cruelty. Babies were dashed against rocks or had their brains bashed out. Children were torn apart before their parents' eyes. Parents were forced to watch their children die under torture before being killed themselves. Hundreds who sought refuge in caves or on high precipices, like the towering Mount Castelluzzo, were discovered and hurled to their deaths below, an image immortalized in John Milton's later sonnet, describing the bloody Piedmontese that rolled, mother with infant, down the rocks. This was not merely killing, it was a calculated exercise in terror, aimed at shattering the community physically and spiritually, leaving a message of absolute domination etched in blood and suffering. Estimates of the dead vary, ranging from 1,712 to around 2,000, or even as high as 4,000 to 6,000. Entire villages were razed to the ground, leaving smoking ruins where homes and churches once stood. In the immediate aftermath of the slaughter, the valleys were scenes of desolation. Survivors who had escaped the initial onslaught fled for their lives. Many scrambled higher into the unforgiving mountains, where the lingering cold of early spring claimed more lives through exposure. Others sought refuge across the border in the Valley of Perosa, known to the French as Perouse, which was then under French control. This adjacent territory became a crucial sanctuary, a place to regroup and mourn, but despair quickly turned to defiance. Among the traumatized survivors, armed resistance groups began to form. Leaders emerged from the chaos, figures like the pastor Jean Leger, Bartolomeo Jahier, and most notably, the farmer-turned-guerrilla captain Joshua Janavel, also known as Gianavello. Operating from hidden headquarters in the Angrogna Valley, Janavel rallied a militia estimated at perhaps 2,000 combatants. They employed the terrain they knew intimately, waging a guerrilla war against the occupying Savoyard forces, launching raids and ambushes. Some attacks were even launched from the relative safety of the French Chisone Valley, striking back across the river. This turn to armed struggle represented a significant shift for a people whose early tradition emphasized nonviolence. While they had defended themselves in past conflicts, the scale and brutality of the 1655 massacre convinced many that armed resistance was now the only path to survival. The fight was framed in religious terms. Soldiers prayed and sang psalms before battle, and pastors worked to maintain discipline among the fighters. Their cause was bolstered by external support. An international brigade of around 500 volunteers, mostly French Huguenots, organized near Pianezza in French territory and crossed the border to join the fight, bringing with them much-needed reinforcements, including cavalry. The scattered remnants of the Waldensians were fighting back, their resistance fueled by desperation and burgeoning support from abroad. News of the Piedmontese Easter spread like wildfire through the communication networks of Protestant Europe. Within days, accounts of the atrocities, carried by fleeing refugees and documented by leaders like Jean Leger, who traveled across the continent sharing his people's plight, reached Geneva, Paris, Amsterdam, London, and various German states. Pamphlets and gazettes quickly picked up the story, amplifying the horror and sparking widespread outrage. The reaction was particularly strong in England, then under the rule of the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, a devout Puritan, saw the attack on the Waldensians, whom many English Protestants viewed as heroic precursors to the Reformation, as an assault on the Protestant faith itself. He acted swiftly and decisively. A national day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer was declared to mourn the victims. Cromwell launched a nationwide fundraising campaign to provide relief for the survivors, contributing a substantial £2,000 from his own funds. The public response was extraordinary, ultimately raising around £39,000, a massive sum for the time, equivalent to millions today, demonstrating the depth of English sympathy. John Milton, Cromwell's Latin secretary and one of England's greatest poets, was deeply moved by the events. Believing the Waldensians had preserved pure Christian truth through ages of darkness, he penned his famous and powerful sonnet on the late massacre in Piedmont, which began with the impassioned plea, "Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold." This poem became a rallying cry, encapsulating the horror and indignation felt across Protestant Europe. A famous painting later depicted Cromwell dictating letters of protest to Milton, with Andrew Marvell poised to write, symbolizing the fusion of political will and intellectual power in response to the crisis. Beyond prayer and poetry, Cromwell exerted significant diplomatic pressure. He dispatched Sir Samuel Morland as a special envoy to the Duke of Savoy in Turin to deliver England's formal protest and coordinate the distribution of relief funds. Morland's subsequent history documented the atrocities he investigated. Cromwell wrote letters to other European rulers, urging collective action. Crucially, he leveraged England's geopolitical position. He threatened the Duke of Savoy with direct military intervention, suggesting the English navy might be sent to the Savoyard port of Nice. He also put pressure on France, Savoy's powerful ally whose troops had participated in the massacre. England was negotiating an important alliance with France against Spain at the time, and Cromwell made it clear that continued persecution of the Waldensians could jeopardize the treaty. This combination of moral outrage, financial aid, and hard-nosed diplomacy made England's intervention particularly potent. The response from other Protestant states was also significant. The Dutch Republic expressed outrage through numerous pamphlets condemning the violence. Following petitions from the Swiss cantons, the Dutch organized national collections to aid the refugees and sent their own special envoy to Turin to advocate for the Waldensians. The Protestant Swiss cantons, geographically close and religiously aligned, were deeply involved, providing refuge, petitioning other states for help, and engaging in diplomatic efforts. There were real fears among diplomats that the crisis could escalate into a wider European religious war, undoing the fragile peace established after the 30 Years' War. The sheer scale of the brutality even prompted intervention from Catholic France, where Cardinal Mazarin, likely concerned about the international outcry and Cromwell's pressure, urged the Duke of Savoy towards moderation. This powerful wave of transnational solidarity, fueled by shared faith, humanitarian concern, and the effective dissemination of atrocity narratives, placed immense pressure on the Duchy of Savoy. Faced with widespread international condemnation, the active resistance of Waldensian survivors, and the credible threat of English military intervention, Duke Charles Emmanuel II was forced to relent. On August 18, 1655, he issued the Pinerolo Declaration of Mercy, often referred to as the Patenti di Grazia, or Letters of Grace. This declaration effectively constituted a peace treaty, bringing an end to the immediate hostilities. While the specific terms are not fully detailed in all surviving accounts, the pressure likely forced the Duke to restore some rights, possibly reaffirming the conditions of the earlier Peace of Cavour, allowing the Waldensians to remain in their designated valleys, albeit under duress. However, this peace was born of external pressure, not a change of heart in Turin. It addressed the immediate crisis but did not resolve the fundamental conflict between the Duke's policy of religious uniformity and the Waldensians' determination to maintain their faith. The